Hello and welcome back to Building Wealth on the Go, a podcast by KLT Wealth Management. Today is May 21st, 2024. We are back with Season 5, Episode 5 of our podcast. I'm your host, Brad Wilson, joined by my colleagues Joe Filimeni and Courtney Beach. Fresh off a very warm, long weekend here in Ontario. Nice to finally have that sunshine, that heat kick in. And really get you feeling like summer's right around the corner. So it's a nice feeling to have. So because we're all fresh with sunshine, I think it's a good way to introduce this podcast topic of difficult financial conversations. So now that you've all relaxed, it's time to sort of dive into that topic today. It's going to link back to a lot of different discussions we've already had on previous podcasts and whatnot. But I think it's important that a lot of these conversations, these topics aren't really discussed until you're right into the thick of them. And I think that's where we find having those open communications with your advisors, with your partners, with your family members, whomever it might be. It's important to have those early and often because it only helps to lead to more financial success. So without further ado, I think let's dive in today right off the bat with sort of one of the more difficult conversations surrounding debt. Debt loads, debt management. And I also think it ties a little bit into cash flow as well, where you're allocating your funds on a regular basis. So Courtney, do you want to maybe talk about sort of debt management and that sort of difficult conversation and what's important on that front?
Well, I can certainly start. I think what's difficult for a lot of people with debt management is just being open and honest about it. I think a lot of people, they go to the store and they just blindly shop for things without really thinking of the bigger impact. And I think really just sitting down and understanding where you're at, where your money's going, and just being honest with yourself. And if you're in a relationship with your partner about where you're at, I think that's the first step when it comes to discussing debt management.
Yeah. I think tracking is one of the biggest things, right? And understanding what sort of debt you're getting yourselves into. We talked about debt a few podcast episodes ago. So if you haven't already checked that one out, make sure to go do so, because I think it's important to understand that aspect of debt in a conversation as well.
I think the important thing to remember is that in a lot of the relationships, the one of the partners is heavily involved in the finances in general, and then one partner is not. And this is very, very common in a relationship. And sometimes it's by choice, right? Like it's not a question of one partner holding out on the other one. Just some partners just can't be bothered with it. And we do find, it's typically the man that's handling the finances.
Not always, but yes.
Yeah, but on an average basis, when we look at our clientele, that the man comes in and the spouse comes in and she can't be bothered, with any of the conversations if she comes in at all. So I think that sort of stems right away where, as a couple, they need to have those discussions together. And especially when it comes to the debt management, is the understanding that how much debt do we have and how are we going to deal with this debt?
Yeah, I agree, especially with the older generation. We see a lot more of the men take charge with the cash flow. I think younger generations, we're seeing more people share, or even the woman who's more managing the dollars and cents. But yeah, I think it's about a lot of communication. I think a lot of people don't even want to deal with it. Like, who wants to talk about debt? It's not fun to talk about, but you need to actually sit down and have that conversation. Where are you? Because then if you're aware, you can make wiser decisions.
Yeah. And I think the big thing when we talk about debt and why these conversations are so important and so important early is because we know that debt is a snowball. And when you get going on it, and often that first piece of debt is often a student loan, right? We find no matter where you are in Canada, less so than in the US, obviously, with the amount of debt, but you can still rack up a significant amount of debt here in Canada of student loan debt. And then that can be the first snowball. And then from there, you're getting access to a credit card or a credit line. And then that becomes that snowball effect. And you run into now a world where inflation's run rampant. It's a high cost of living. And people are just kicking the debt can down the road, saying, well, I'll just pay the interest. I'll keep spending. And then if I want to spend a little bit more, I'll pay a little bit of principal off. But they're kicking the can down the road and trying to live for today, enjoy today. And I think that's the problem of it's almost like you're pushing off going to the doctor, right? It's like a similar issue than that, and it's almost letting that condition just get worse and worse. And that's where debt is a difficult conversation, right? And how do you approach that with do you see if you see a friend going through that, if you see a family member going through that, or as an advisor we see clients having those issues, you need to have those conversations, right? It's important to talk about as soon as possible, because the interest rates, especially in today's environment, even on a mortgage, are over 5%. So you've got to have those conversations about what that means and what that translates to.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brad, because Canadians have gotten so comfortable with holding debt. Like, we're one of the most debt laden countries in the world. It's just the way our society is set up. But sometimes we get a little too comfortable with it, like it's something that definitely needs to be managed.
Yeah, and we're, to an earlier point in terms of one partner being heavily involved in it nowadays, and I'll say it, the newer generation, they don't get married. So they're together in a relationship. They're not married. So they are keeping their finances separate completely. So you are getting both parties that are involved in their finances and their debts. But I think the key thing is the communication, because they're not communicating with one another, even though they're not married, but they're in a relationship. You do what you want to do, I'll do what I want to do, and we'll keep it separate. It's pretty common to finally get them in a room together and have some conversations, only to be for each other to be surprised as to what they have or don't have in the case of debt. So it certainly is a changing way of dealing with the relationship and the
Yeah,
communications.
and I think before we dive a little bit more into the topic of sharing finances and dealing with partners, I think last thing on sort of the debt side of things is it really becomes a conversation around spending habits with debt, because either you're spending that on a credit card or you're avoiding paying down student loans to pay something else off or to purchase something else. So it's that cost of, okay, I'm not going to pay my debt down this month, I'm going to buy a new TV, right? And so it's, what are you prioritizing, and having that discussions on a monthly basis. And whether you're an individual, whether you're a couple, whether you're dealing in family finances, that's important to look at those spending habits and where you're prioritizing those funds, especially in difficult economic environments, because we always go through these cycles. And when now you're worrying about a high debt load and servicing that debt while also trying to buy groceries, during the times when the debt was cheap, that wasn't the time to rack up more debt, right? That was the time to pay it down. And that's where, Courtney, you mentioned, we're comfortable with it. Oh, interest rates are low, take on more debt, take on more debt, right? And now interest rates are high and people are struggling with that debt, especially if you entered into a variable rate mortgage, you refinanced your mortgage. And so that's where I think those conversations and really taking a deep look at, where am I spending my money? And should I really focus on going to rice and beans every meal and paying down this debt as quickly as possible? Like, what are my best options, especially if you're paying double digit plus interest rates, right?
It's a sense of entitlement, I think, in today's world, that we look around and we say, I want that big screen TV. I want that new furniture. I want that, BMW, and I'll lease it. And I think society as a whole has instilled that with us, that we should be getting it. We do deserve it. We work hard. So it's a bit of a vicious circle here, that is pushing us, is forcing us to get out there and buy, and encouraging us to buy and buy more. The likes of a Costco and a superstores and stuff like that, they want us to buy more, right? And with no sort of thoughts in terms of that debt, whether it's being a credit card debt or a line of credit. So it's pushing us to buy more and more. But we do have to sit back or stand back, and especially when you're in a relationship, and just kind of budget or cash flow it, make our priorities. We want to spend it here, but be happy not to spend today, but be able to spend it tomorrow. Like, I have a trip planned for next year. Okay, what am I going to do without this year in order to save for that trip for next year? And instead of just saying, well, I'm going to do everything this year and next year and just throw it on a credit card. So being able to do that and having that communications with your partner, I think, is
Yeah.
important.
No, I think the cash flow and prioritizing is very, very important. And looking at it early, being aware of what debt you're taking on, being conscious of where you're spending that money, what vehicle is it? Is it going on a credit line? Is it going on a credit card? Understanding that that isn't your money, and that, that's an important piece of the puzzle. So, Joe, I know you've sort of touched on it a little bit, but let's jump into our second sort of difficult conversation surrounding dealing with a partner, and managing finances with a partner. I think the big one is when you're coming into a relationship is, when do you have that finance talk, right? When do you have that money talk? How much do you have? How much do I have? Because at the end of the day, I know marriage rates are a lot lower, but even when you become common law, you're considered, to be tied at some points. If you're living with somebody, there's this similar, not the exact same, but very similar legalities around how things are managed. So I think it's important to figure out when the best time is for that. And I think it's a case by case scenario of whenever it feels right. But if you're going to be moving in with somebody, you got to have a conversation about money, because at the end of the day, you're sharing expenses. Anytime you're getting into sharing expenses or sharing a day-to-day living cost, you need to have a conversation about what you're managing your money. Because if you leave out that you've got a $50,000 student debt with your partner, and they're wondering, well, why aren't you able to contribute X amount of money to joint expenses or whatnot? Well, you're busy servicing this debt, right? So you got to have those conversations, and really be transparent with each other, because I think that's where we run into a lot of relationship issues now, as people hide a lot of things around money, and especially debt, because there is a preconceived notion and that stigma around carrying debt, which I think it's important to kind of break down and say, hey, it's okay, you've got debt, but there's ways out of it, and there's lots of tools and strategies now that you can focus on that, and working with your partner is probably one of the best starting points for that.
Yeah, like, I think in this day and age, you almost have to run a credit application when getting into a relationship, just to kind of make sure you guys approve each other, I guess, from a financial point of view. It's a difficult conversation. Like, you are, at the beginning of a relationship, and when do you start talking about financing? I think it should be natural. I think it's something, it should be natural that you begin to share, much as like you're sharing your goals with your partner, you're sharing your dreams with your partner. I think it's very important to share the reality of your current situation, good or bad or indifferent, so that you should have that open conversation at an early stage, so that you both have the understanding of where everybody is. And then, see if you can work together in order to help each other out, I think is really key. I think, but that could be a challenge in itself, right? Many, relationships, well, I think, finances is one of the biggest cause of divorce or separation of some kind, right? And so, that could stem from the fact that, people are hiding things, or not even so much hiding, maybe they're embarrassed. I think it's the embarrassment is probably the more challenge, which makes it more difficult for us to talk about it. Like, I have a $500,000 mortgage, oh my god, or I have 30,000 sitting on my credit card, right? So I think that is where the challenge arises, but you got to kind of break down those barriers and have those conversations.
I think it's too not just what you have or you don't have, but also your priorities when it comes to spending money. Like, are you a person who likes to go out every night, for supper, or you like to stay in and save your money? Like, I think that becomes a problem with a lot of people, is where they spend their money and what their goals and priorities are for it. So you need to talk about that.
Yeah, I think like when you're looking at sort of that initial stage, and Joe, I don't think you're really wrong about the credit application, because I think you know it's like one of the worst things is you show up to buy a house and you're buying a house jointly and you get declined for a mortgage application because, oh yeah, I forgot about my bankruptcy 4 years ago, right? Or something like that, right? Like, and so there's situations where you'll run into, oh, I didn't think it was that big of a deal to bring that up, right? And so that's where I think like you've got to be full and transparent about everything, even if you don't think it matters. It matters to be, open and honest about everything. Look at everything, even sitting down together with some sort of advisor, go to the bank, have a conversation about what your options are, because when you're looking at sharing and amalgamating any sort of expenses, because like at the end of the day, everything down the road will be dependent on you being aware of what's going on right now, because everything will factor in at some point in time.
And we should also bring into the conversation, children at some point in time, right? And when you do have children in a relationship, I think that there should be conversation with your child in terms of where you are financially, because there's often difficult situations where the child wants to go here, wants to go there, wants to play hockey, wants to play soccer, and again, it's budgeting or cash flowing it, it's prioritizing the expenses and having those conversations at an early stage with your children is very, very important in helping them at some point in time understand finances. And I can't emphasize that enough, that if you don't have the conversation, your kids think that money grows on trees and mom and dad will, essentially bail us out. Well, have those early conversations when they're teenagers, explain finances to them, explain your finances, and I think they're going to turn out to be better managers of their money
I
as
think,
well.
yeah, I think that's a good point, Joe, because we've got marketing experts targeting young kids, like especially kids and teenagers, getting them on the brand name trail, everything brand name, every sports and extracurricular activity you can think of. And they don't realize that, this costs money. And, if they get that mentality and then they grow up with it, you know, they're more apt to take out the loans, put it on a credit card to pay it later. So yeah, I agree. Teach them early.
Yeah, and I think you both very good points. I think you jumped a little bit on the kids thing, Joe. I think it's important to have a conversation about finances prior to having a kid, because having a kid in general is going to cost you money, and if you go on maternity leave, you take parental leave, that all is going to take a big hit to your finances, right? So even preparing for, do you want kids, how many kids do you want to have, what's the plan, are you going to take time off, do you want to take time, right? So all those conversations, and when you're early in a relationship it might be difficult, but even having a sense, an idea, and everyone's things, it can always change depending on your situation, but it's that constant open communication and transparency about everything that I think is really, really important when you're entering any of those stages with a partner. But one thing I want to touch on, sort of, and I think it's a big conversation for debate amongst couples nowadays, is how do you manage your banking, right? Like, how do you manage your finances? Do you keep completely separate accounts? Do you amalgamate to a joint account? Do you have little accounts everywhere that you have some access to, the other one has some access to, some are joint? How does managing that work? And there's a lot of different theories out for what is best when it comes to that, but I think at the end of the day, if you are married, everything is all is one, right? At the end of the day, like the way that the government looks at it, all is one. And I think having the mentality that you're on the same page and you're working together to one common goal, like that you agreed to when you got married, I think that often works the best. Not for everybody, but it often does work the best when you are able to sit down together, have that discussion, but know everything's moving from one central location.
Well, maybe we switch gears and we talk about aging parents now, because that's a huge, huge thing, as we see, and we've talked about it for many, many years, of the aging baby boomers, right? And having, and so if my parents are the aging baby boomers, for example, how do I have that conversation with my parents about their finances? And that generation, that older generation, is very tight-lipped about finances. So it's no wonder we grew up the way we did, but they're very tight-lipped, and we find with the older clients it's very difficult for them to start the conversation with their children, with their adult children, on their own finances. And I know in our office that we've sort of had these family meetings in order to have like a third party in the room in order to kind of help out, start that conversation and have sort of more open dialogue. But it's very, very important because of estate planning.
It's not only important because of estate planning, but at some point, for a lot of parents, they're going to be taken care of by their kids. They're going to be taking over as power of attorney, and for them to go into it blind, not knowing where everything is or what their parents' financial priorities are, what their interests would be, or their like. We've come across POAs that really are lost for several months trying to figure out where everything is and what their parents want them to do with the money and to take care of them. So it's important to get those stepping stones in place before you need to pull the trigger and put the power of attorney in place, so your kids can do, what you need them to do, what you would like them to do with your money.
And oftentimes we find that, like you said, Courtney, like the power of attorneys, they get put on almost too late, right? Where or you're waiting to the last moment, and, all those issues arise around helping your parents out, and helping that older generation. And I think a big thing to look at too is the economical landscape has changed dramatically over the last, 10, 15 years, where, in retirement, it was very set in stone. Now, a lot of these older, parents and older family members are sitting on, gigantic valued properties. And how do you deal with that? How do you manage that, right? Are they going to stay in that home? Are they going to go live somewhere else? Do they need money that's tied up in the home? How is all that being managed? So I think the way that the finances are being managed by a lot of, especially, how advisors are advising on these situations, it's definitely different than it was even 5-6 years ago, pre-pandemic, right? Because of the value that's now within these homes. And then you look at the cost of living. And so there's a lot of really important conversations that need to happen about how is this all going to happen. And like you said, Joe, having the next generation into who is going to take care of them, I think is important, because at some point in time, it becomes a little bit too much overcapacity for a lot of older clients to worry about, and adds a lot of unneeded stress when you're in your 70s, 80s, and 90s, that you don't need to worry about all of that, right? Like, that's the last thing you want to be stressing about, is how things are happening, because oftentimes it can be really complicated to comprehend as well.
Yeah, and you, if there's nothing else to encourage you to have conversations and to begin estate planning in general, is the idea, or is the fact that the government will be right there in order to take a piece of your estate. So do you want to have that conversation? Do you want to set up your estate planning in order to minimize as much as possible any taxes upon final passing, or do you want the government just to take their pound of flesh? So it's really up to you how you want to leave after you've worked so hard on building an estate.
Yeah, and another point is, especially with baby boomers and the older generation, there was this mentality to hide money in various places. They wouldn't have all their money with one advisor or one bank. They'd have a little bit here, a little bit there, because it was safer. It was considered safer. The problem is when you can no longer care for that money, or you've passed away. Now your kids have to come in, and they have, or your executor, and they have to figure out where all this money is. And if they're lucky, they have a paper trail in your home to kind of track it down. That's not always the case. So you really need to have it listed out and have that conversation. Hey, I have this little bank account here. I have this there. And if you can even start is consolidating it for them, like work together with them to get it all nice and tidy, so it's easier for you, so it's easier for them. And like you said, Joe, maybe do some planning so the government doesn't get a huge chunk out of it when the time comes.
And I think, just on the last sort of thing on the estate planning, is don't let the estate planning conversation wait till you're 75, right? Have that conversation excuse me, when you're younger, because I think even, we talk about difficult conversations as a couple, sitting down and writing your will early, who's going to take care of your kids? We don't know what the next day and the next week holds for everybody. So I think it's important that the sooner you have that difficult conversation about what does our estate and planning for our estate look like, even if it's in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, I think is a very important conversation to have, even though it's a weird, morbid, and difficult conversation to have at a young age. It's a very, very important one, because if, God forbid, something does happen, then, it just causes a really big mess at that stage. And I think that's where, just having the peace of mind that that's all taken care of and you have a plan in place, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Brad, because a lot of people do wait till they're, older and they're not as healthy. I mean, you can always update a will. I know that, it can be kind of pricey, but, there are other options that are not as pricey out there for writing a will. And, at the end of the day, if you're saving money that's not going to the tax man because you got it, you took the time to do a will, why not spend the money to make sure your family is taken care of when you're gone?
Yeah, exactly. No, so I think that's great for sort of our main topic today, which was the difficult conversations. We'll do a quick market outlook for June. We've seen a bit of a rally through a bit of May here. Markets have sort of rebounded back up through a little bit of a volatile and a slight pullback in April. Numbers with earnings season have been relatively positive for the most part. We have seen some companies fall off a little bit. I think it was Shopify took a relatively big hit. But overall, we've seen sort of the slowing economic numbers and the stronger earnings reports propel the markets a bit back up. A lot of the eyes are on the Bank of Canada rate decision beginning of June. I think that's one of the big ones. We did have strong job numbers here in Canada. So the now predicted rate cut is below, or a 50%, less than a 50% chance of a rate cut in June. More people are lending towards a July rate cut here in Canada, with the US first rate cut priced in for November right now. So will be interesting to see sort of how all that unfolds over the next little bit. We did get inflation down to 2.7% in April. Those numbers just came out this morning. So we are starting to see all the core metrics slowing, and more so here in Canada than the US. So I think Canada will be quicker than the US to cut rates as sort of predicted. But everyone is hinging on what happens in June. So with that, we will close out the podcast today, Joe, with your tip of the month for the month of May.
All right, just to stay on topic, some tips of the month. So for our younger viewers, or viewers and listeners, I guess, in terms of sort of the communications with your better half, I think is very, very important about debt management, your goals, your finances. Have those conversations, have them with your kids. For that older group that is part of our listeners, the same deal here. Have the conversations with your kids about what you have in terms of your investments. I encourage you to bring your children, one representative, to a meeting with your financial advisor, with your bank. When you're having those conversations, get them in so that they recognize the person that's managing your investments. There's a connection there. That would be my recommendation, is trying to kind of get that communications happening. If worse comes to worse and you're not comfortable with it, ask your financial advisor to sit in on the meetings with you, because I think it would be beneficial in the long run for all parties.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. And thank you, everyone listening, viewing, wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. Thank you so much. Make sure to leave a rating or a like on whatever platform you're listening to, and subscribe on that platform as well to the podcast. Thank you, everyone, so much. And we'll be back with a podcast next month. Thanks for listening.